So this rapid response program differs a little bit from our normal Tuesday programming, and it's meant to tackle quickly evolving issues and help you understand them and give you a context for analysis. Today's program examines the Israeli government's move to the right and implications for an independent judiciary and democracy. Our experts today will help us understand what's happening now in Israel and its implications for the country, the region, and the world. Long form bios are online. I'm trying to keep this relatively short so that we spend most of our time in discussion, but we have to my far right, Guy Grossman, who is a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. His research is in applied political economy with substantive focus on the intersection of technology and governance, political accountability, forced migration, and conflict processes, and a regional focus on sub-Saharan Africa and Israel-Palestine. He's the founder and co-director of Penn's Development Research Initiative. His work has appeared in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, International Organization, and Journal of Politics, among other journals. To his left, to my right, Dan Kellerman is professor of political science and law and chair of the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University. He is also an adjunct professor of European Union law at the University of Pennsylvania's Carey Law School. Kellerman's research focuses on the politics of the European Union, law and politics, comparative political economy, and comparative public policy. Last but not least, our program today will be moderated by Trudy Rubin, who is the worldview columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and member of the Inquirer's editorial board and a visiting fellow at Perry Roll House. Her column runs in many other U.S. newspapers. She has covered the MENA region for over 4 decades. In 2017 and 2001, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Before joining the Inquirer in 1983, she was the Middle East correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. And with that, I turn the program over to our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Right. So what we are going to do is we're going to start with some initial remarks by Guy and Dan, and I'll just say a few sentences, add a few, and then I'm going to ask each panelist a couple of questions, and then we're going to turn it over to you. So let me start with Guy.
Thanks, Trudy. So I want to start by thanking Perry Wilders for organizing this event in such a short notice. Can you hear?
Not really.
So should speak louder? Okay. So I just want to start by thanking Perry Wilders for organizing the event, Trudy for stepping up, and moderating in such a short time, and all of you that found time to convene here. And this is a critical moment in the history of Israel. And given the centrality of Israel to obviously to Middle East politics, but not only to Middle East politics, also to American politics, I think we should approach this critical moment with some clarity in terms of what is actually happening on the ground. So I'm going to spend my opening statements just describing the various bills that are going through the Knesset now. I'm going to describe them with an eye towards the way they change the status quo, and with an eye towards explaining to you why those amendments and laws are problematic, in what way they are dangerous to democracy. And in my opening statement, I'll try to stick to facts. Okay, so facts are not partisan, they're not pro-Israel, they're not anti-Israel. Facts are just facts. Okay. I think in a background, as a background, before I describe these laws that are being proposed and going through the legislative process, I think as a background, we need to first acknowledge that outside of election, Israel has very few checks and balances of the power of the government to begin with. Okay, so Israel has no written constitution. The presidency is mostly ceremonial, doesn't have much power. And we have a parliamentary system in Israel, which means that the government effectively controls the legislator. So, and another thing is that unlike, for example, the United States and UK and other countries that have 2 parliaments or 2 legislators, like an upper and lower body, Israel has only one. So So that means to begin with, Israel starts with the premise of quite few checks and balances on the government. Where do these checks and balances come? They come from mostly three bodies in the justice system that are quite independent. One is the judiciary, the second one is the Office of the Attorney General, and the third one is the police and the prosecution. The bills that are being passed now or proposed and going through the legislature quite rapidly are all designed to curtail and sometimes eliminate the independent power of these three different bodies, okay? I'm going to start with the judiciary because that's probably the most dramatic arena for what things are happening. And I'm going to demonstrate to you that two things are happening, or there's two ways in which the independence of the judiciary is going to be severely curtailed. One is through a change in the way judges get selected and promoted. And the second way is through elimination, not reduction, elimination of all forms of judicial review. So the first component speaks to, in the judiciary overhaul, speaks to the selection of judges. So currently in Israel, there's a judicial selection committee of 9 members. In order to be selected as a judge or promoted from like a lower court to a higher court, you need to have the support of 7 out of 9 members of that committee. The government only has 3 seats in the judicial selection committee in Israel, explicitly to make this process less politicized. In the proposed amendment, there are going to be 2 changes. One is the composition of the committee, given the government instead of 3 seats, that just gives them a veto power, but not majority. They're going to have 5 seats out of 9, giving them a majority. And the second change is that instead of 7 out of 9 committee members, the proposal now is to have only a simple majority of 5 of 9, effectively giving the government the ability to select judges as it sees fit, okay? Why should you be worried? Well, you should be worried because it will politicize the bench, but it also means that judges might be selected on the basis of holding the right ideology or having the right connections rather than the merit-based system that we have now. The second drama around the judiciary is elimination, or the proposed elimination of a judicial review. Currently in Israel, since around the mid-90s, the Supreme Court, or the High Court, as it's called in Israel, has asserted its right to annul laws that are passed by the Knesset under certain conditions. They need to contradict basic laws, and they have to form, they need some grave violation of human rights. The way the judicial, and it was in the 30 years that we have judicial review in Israel, it's been used only 22 times. Okay, just to be clear, it's not that like the Knesset, the judiciary keeps annulling the laws of the majority. The proposed laws are going to eliminate it in using three amendments to the basic law of the judiciary and the basic law of the Knesset. The first way that they're going to eliminate that or curtail that would be by mandating that annulling a law, calling a law void, will need to have a supermajority of 12 out of 15 Supreme Court judges. Okay, so that's a very, very high bar to declare a law unconstitutional. Or we don't have a constitution, so it's more about contradicts like the protections that we have through some basic laws. The second way in which judicial review is being challenged is by, and this is quite radical, is that if the Supreme Court manages to find the 12 out of 15 judges to call a law null, the law then will go back to the Knesset, and the Knesset can re-vote and reenact the law that was considered void by the Supreme Court in a simple majority of 61 votes. Okay, in Israel we refer to that as the overriding clause. So the idea is there's an overriding clause that basically says every simple majority can reenact a law that has been nulled by the Supreme Court, effectively meaning that there's no judicial review.
It's a majority of one. We're going to have to speed it up.
And then the last way in which the judicial review is going to be eliminated is by mandating that the Supreme Court has no power on calling basic laws. They have no judicial review over basic laws. Okay, so because we don't have a constitution and a well-defined definition of what is a basic law, effectively the government can have a basic law, Benjamin Netanyahu is prime minister for life, or basic law that only Zionist parties can run for office. They call it a basic law, and that is outside the purview of judicial review. Okay, so to take all of these things together, these laws are designed, and amendments are designed to eliminate the ability of the courts to check in any way the power of the government. I know that I'm out of time. I'll just mention that this is not the only arena that the government is overhauling. There's also curtailing the powers of the Attorney General in certain ways. If people are interested, I can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. And another dangerous development is the subjugating the police to the ministry in a way that we don't have now. So the police is relatively independent in terms of its decision of persecution, and that is going to be changed if the current laws are going to be passed. So I'm just going to stop here. I'm just going to mention that people that are disturbed about what's going on in Israel are not only disturbed by the content of the laws, but also by the process in which they are being enacted. This is a major overhaul of the system as we know it, and it's done not in a deliberative process, not in an inclusive process, by ramping through very fast without much discussion between different parts of the country. So I'm gonna.
I would just add a sentence here that to get an idea of what it means to give a radical nationalist minister control over the police, you can see what just happened when the Minister of National Security tried to fire the police chief in Tel Aviv because he wasn't tough enough on demonstrators, meaning beating them up. And this has caused a whole upheaval in the police. And I won't go into it in detail. We can in questions if you want to ask Guy, but it gives you an example. It really means being able to use the police for very political reasons. So let me ask you, Dan, where does Israel fall in terms of the broader illiberal global movement that is undermining democracy, as we've seen happen in Hungary, a country which is much beloved both by Bibi Netanyahu and by President Trump, and by CPAC, which invited its leader, Viktor Orban, to speak last year at their conference, and to a lesser extent in Poland.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And thanks all of you for having me. As you probably gathered from the introduction, I am not an expert in Israeli politics, and that is not my role here. Really, I think I'm here because I study democratic backsliding. In particular, I've done a lot of work on attacks on judicial independence and the role of that in the process of backsliding. And as Trudy was saying, I done a lot of work on Hungary and Poland in particular, and some other countries as well. So, I mean, just to give context, Hungary and Poland are the two most rapidly backsliding democracies in the world over the past decade. That's true whether you look at various indices, VDEM, Freedom House, other, and you can also look at not just democracy indices, but sort of rule of law measures and things like that. So, you know, these are two important cases if we want to think about the global pattern and be able to think about Israel and where it may compare, okay? a few takeaways from studying those cases as we observe all the events that Guy was describing and think about what's happening in Israel. First thing I'd say is there's a pretty standard elected autocrats playbook. And when I say an elected autocrat, what I mean is someone wins a free and fair election, but they aspire to entrench themselves long-term so that they can transform what was a constitutional democracy, sort of a regular liberal democracy, into what political scientists call competitive authoritarian regime, or sometimes they call it an electoral autocracy. So we're not talking about dictatorship or something real harsh, but we're talking about, a system where the ruling party tilts the playing field so decisively in its favor that it becomes practically impossible for the opposition to win. And if you succeed in that entrenchment, then you kind of maintain some of the facade, and you have elections and there are opposition parties, but you use various legal mechanisms to tilt the playing field to ensure your grip on power. So anyway, that's the kind of what some of these aspiring autocrats aspire to, that kind of electoral autocracy. So they have a playbook, and the playbook is pretty standard. After you win an election, step one, capture the referees, judiciary. They always go first after the judiciary. And this is crucial because many of the next steps you want to take could be impeded by the judiciary, right? So you want to capture the referees first. And, by the way, famous books like How Democracies Die by Levitsky and Ziblatt, they talk a lot about this too, the importance of capturing the referees right away. So once you have the referees or the judiciary, then you want to seize control of as much of the media as you can, state media usually first, then maybe private sector media to the extent you can. Next, you want to find ways to demonize and undermine the opposition using your control of media. And, you can also do various shenanigans if you get control of different electoral bodies. You can ban opposition parties, disenfranchise certain voting blocks, et cetera. And then the last, key step before the next election, you want to change electoral rules. And again, these things, it's crucial to have control of the judiciary so that the judiciary doesn't say these moves are illegal, right? So you'll want to, and there's various stratagems depending on the country, whether it's gerrymandering of different sorts or banning certain parties, whatever. You want to rig the rules of the electoral game before the next election so that you can kind of ensure your own victory. So that's the kind of playbook. Then you win a new free but unfair election, right? And there you go. And then, you're in power for a few decades, hopefully, is the general pattern. So, are there parallels? Do we see the new Netanyahu government deploying the elected autocrats playbook, or the aspiring autocrats playbook? Again, I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, but everything I've been reading about all the reforms, or I don't really like the word reform because reform has a very positive connotation, right? Let's just call them changes, right? That Guy was describing, I'd say it sure looks like it, right? It sure looks like it. Exactly. I mean, it's the parallels between what the government has proposed, what the protesters are fighting against right now, are between what's on the table there and what was done in Hungary and Poland in particular is striking. Okay. And before I'll say a couple of things. I have just another minute, Rudy, about some of those parallels. But I would say one thing that's also striking is the speed, right? The way this is being done so quickly. Something that's important to remember in both the Hungarian and Polish case that's a parallel is that the parties in question had been in power before, and they were Democrats. So like Orban's Fidesz party, people may not have liked him or his ideology. Some people liked him, some didn't. But he was a straight up, center-right Democrat, right? And so then it maybe surprised a lot of people that when he came back, he had this autocratic mindset. But I think a parallel with Netanyahu is, and also with the peace government in Poland, is they didn't like their period outside of power, and they kind of vowed in that period of opposition, when we get back in power, we're going to do things differently to make sure we can entrench our power long term. And they set up plans, right, and had all the laws kind of pre-written, in particular for a crackdown on the judiciary. So you saw right away in Hungary, within months of Orban getting reelected, he rolled out this at lightning speed, this series of attacks on the judiciary. Same thing 5 years later in Poland when peace came to power. So the way that this government has come in, and it was right there in the coalition agreement, and they just roll out these laws that had been obviously prepared, that's a parallel. So what substantively, are the parallels there? Well, yeah, in Hungary after 2010, we see the same things. They go first after the Constitutional Court. They first enlarge the court, right? So they can pack it with regime-friendly judges, okay? And then they also limit its jurisdiction, eliminating certain kinds of cases. So that's step number one. After they succeeded in capturing the Constitutional Court, so this is something to look to next stages if they succeed here in Israel, then they go after the rest of the regular judiciary. So then they created a new office, the National Judicial Office, with a friend of Orban. All these people, they all went to college together, by the way, or it's all his friends from law school. So actually the guy who wrote the whole new Hungarian constitution on his iPad and boasted about it, right? He was friend of Orban's from college, and that guy's wife was then appointed the head of the National Judicial Office, who then had complete control over all judicial appointments, promotions, and discipline of judges, allocation of judges, different courts. So, total centralization. They also then take over the public prosecutor, etc. Poland, and I'll finish with this, same thing, but even more dramatic, right, in Poland, and more brazen. Because in Hungary, they actually had a 2/3 majority after that election in 2010, which allowed them to kind of say, well, we can do all these constitutional reforms because with 2/3 we can amend the constitution. In Poland, they didn't even have that authority. So when they attacked and packed the Constitutional Court, then I'm not kidding, the Constitutional Court struck down some of these moves, and the government simply refused to publish its rulings and said, well, a ruling isn't official if it's not published, and we control the printing office. So, and so it started from there. Then they also took over the body, the National Judicial Council, that appoints judges, and it was booted out of the European Association of Judicial Councils for being a tool of the government. They then created a new disciplinary chamber, started firing and financially penalizing judges who stood up to them, etc. Right now, it's all culminated with the EU suspending funds to Poland. And anyway, so those are all sort of foretastes, I think, of where this could be going. And I would just close by saying, in my view, in a way, the situation is more dangerous in Israel. I'll just venture a comment, even though I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, because first of all, for all the failures of the EU and in standing up to this, at least there is some kind of framework that can apply outside pressure. That's less true for a country like Israel. And also, as Guy was saying, there's very few other checks and balances in the system. So some countries where there have been attacks on the judiciary, let's say even in the US or in Brazil, there's more checks in the system, these federal systems. So Israel, I think, seems very vulnerable to these kind of attacks.
I'm just going to start off with one question and a quick answer if we can to get to the audience. Israel also has one other aspect. Maybe there's a similarity in Poland because the Catholic religious establishment is so strong. But in Israel, with the new government dependent on not just nationalist parties, but religious nationalist parties, Guy, how do you see this playing out when you have parties in the government whom Bibi cannot afford to alienate, who believe that Torah law should be the dominant law, and want to try to get that enforced through legislative means?
Yeah, so that's fascinating. So I'll be just really brief in my answer. So I think the drama really starts not in 2023, the drama really starts around 2009 when Netanyahu comes back to power. And that's a deal with the ultra-religious parties in Israel. There's two big blocks of ultra-religious parties, one Ashkenazi and one Sephardi. These parties were traditionally the kingmakers in Israel. They would go with the left, they would go with the right, whoever give them more, and they would be like basically kingmakers. And Netanyahu cuts a deal with them that says, you will stop being kingmakers. You will stop kind of like going with whoever kind of like has a better chance of forming a government. you will always stick with me. And in exchange, there's a lot of things that I can give you that cannot be given to you by the center left because the center left will never give. And so this already starts in 2009. What we're seeing now is a culmination of that promise where Netanyahu says, you are always with me in my bloc. Netanyahu doesn't have a coalition without them, but they don't have necessarily, like they committed to staying with him, even when they had opportunities to go with the center and center left, because he offers them something that no one would offer them, which is what's on the table now. So how is that like relevant? How is that playing out? The ultra-Orthodox parties, they care about a few things. The most important thing for them is to insular their communities from the secular state, okay? And this could be achieved in a few ways. One is by not serving in the military that is mandatory. And the second way is by forming an independent education system that is separated from the public education system. Netanyahu is willing to give both of these things and more, in the sense of like, not only that they can have an own education system, but one that is outside the kind of purview of the kind of the state, like in terms of like just checking what they're doing with the money and just supervision, right? And he's also willing to give them a blank military exemption. The courts in the past have struck all these arrangements down. So they passed these things, came to the courts, and the court said, well, we are, given equality, you can't give them more resources than the regular schools, or you can't exempt everyone from the military if there's a military. So one of the things that is on the table now, the ultra-Orthodox party are the ones that are pushing for this legislation, maybe stronger than any of the other parties, in part because they believe that by neutralizing the court, they can insular the population in a way that they see fit. The other last thing is I talked about that with Ian. We talk a lot about freedom from religion when we talk about liberal democracy. For secular Jews in Israel, the question is not about that, because we have basically it's a Jewish state. So there's no separation between state and church, so to speak. For secular Jews, this is about freedom from religion, right? Can you bury your beloved ones without going through Chevra Kadisha, between the religious establishment? Can you marry without the religious establishment? Can you marry your same-sex partner, right? And for the ultra-Orthodox, a lot of this is pushing against the secular attempt to insulate itself from religion by asserting some laws that could not pass if you have an independent judiciary. I'll just give one example.
You know what, I'm not gonna.
Maybe one example?
2 seconds.
2 seconds. It's because it's all symbolic, right? So there's a law that is being passed now about making it a felony to bring bread during the week of Passover into a public building, right? Obviously, that's like completely crazy, right? This is going to be struck down by the courts, but if you neutralize the court, you can introduce these types of laws that are partly symbolic, but partly about like reasserting the role of religion into people's life, also without the consent.
All right, I'm going to go to the audience. I was going to say a couple of sentences, but because of time, I'm not. I was just going to raise, and you're welcome to raise it from the floor, that I think the political attack on Israel's judiciary and undermining of Israeli democracy is linked in many ways to developments in the West Bank. But I won't talk about that. If somebody wants to raise it, raise your hand. And if you don't want to raise it, ask about anything. So we will do, sir.
Thanks, terrific, really is very good. Yeah, I would like to raise it, not because I don't think that this is a crisis in itself, but that there are really important relationships to the Palestinian question.
So if you could raise it as a question,
I'm going to.
That would be great.
So to what extent, if the Haredim have their particular axe to grind, the national religious are looking at the regularization law and the way the court used the principle of basic law on human dignity and equality to extend constitutional protection to West Bank Palestinians who are not citizens, thereby setting a precedent that in the future they could vote and become part of a non-right-wing dominant group. To what extent are both of those considerations in the backs of the minds or the fronts of the minds of these contending parties? Number one, the regularization law, and number two, the general principle of what will happen to political rights of Palestinians in the future as annexation proceeds.
You want to say something?
I
I mean, I can definitely. Say about that.
I can add to it, but first.
Yes. So the government in Israel is a coalition government, right? There's like different parties are coming together. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that the different parties might have different agendas. So the ultra-Orthodox agenda is mostly internal and about all the things that I said before. The religious Zionist parties headed by Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, who's visiting now DC, and Ben Gvir, who was the Interior Minister, not the Interior Minister, the Minister of National Security. That's keep changing it. It used to be police, now it's national security. They are definitely, I mean, they are settlers, and they have an agenda of entrenching Israel's sovereignty over the West Bank. And it is absolutely clear that their motivation to neutralize the courts is in part an ability, increasing the ability to increase or entrench the control of Israel over the West Bank. I think that is absolutely, that's factual. I'll give one example where the courts intervene. So the courts don't like to intervene on security issues, and they don't like to intervene in the West Bank. And just to be clear, the military occupation of the West Bank is going on, and is going on strong even before these like reforms, right? So just to be clear, the current practice of the Supreme Court is not to intervene on things that are considered security. But there's one place that they do intervene, which is if settlers capture Palestinian private property, that the Palestinians can show that they have like a deed or some way of proving that they have a title over it. The Supreme Court will intervene and will call for the military to remove settlers from that hill and that post, right? And that is something that is definitely a thorn in the eyes of settlers. They want to obviously neutralize that because they believe in playing the long game, where every post, every hill, another hill that you capture until the question of whether Israel has sovereignty over the West Bank becomes moot, right? So that's definitely playing. But I will say that the people that will stand to lose most is probably the Palestinians that are citizens of Israel, that, nominally have, I don't say equal rights, I think that will take it a little bit too far, but have robust rights as citizens of the country. And I think that they will be the first ones to lose, because the system, as it is, intervenes to protect marginalized minorities. The majority doesn't need as many protections. And I think that what we're going to see, if this suite of laws is going to pass, that will be very quickly a disenfranchisement of the Arab citizens of Israel as part of a way of entrenching the coalition in power. Now, here's something to remember, and one last thing, because I think this is probably the most important thing I'll say to you. Once you remove checks on your power, the price of holding the state increases. Because you know that if you lose election, the other side can reverse the things that you have done because there's no check, right? Like there's no judicial review, so the imperative of winning election increases because the price of capturing the state is much, much, much higher. And that means that it becomes impossible to resist making further changes that will make it impossible for you to lose election. And then one thing that is being spoken in back rooms, but it's like floating into like the main rooms, is that they want to make small changes, the government, small changes to the law that governs who can run for election. For example, introducing the idea that only parties that are Zionist and recognize Israel as a Jewish state can stand for election. You do that, you basically tell 20% of the population that is Arab that believe to the most part that Israel has a right to exist, but not necessarily as a Jewish state. They want to have a state of all citizens. If you're a minority, that's something that is legitimately, you can hold that opinion in a legitimate way. But if they cannot run for office, effectively, if you remove 20% of the population from the electorate, you effectively like guarantee the right rule here for our lifetime, right? So that's something to keep in mind.
Steve, you're next, but I just want to add something to this because I think what Guy said is extremely important. As he said, Israeli Arab citizens make up 20% of the population. What we're seeing is that in order for a government in opposition to the government that is in power now to get a majority, it is becoming more and more necessary to have a coalition with Israeli Arab parties. And if there is an attempt to disenfranchise, then it's a further move towards illiberal democracy because you're doing more and more to make it impossible for an alternative coalition to succeed. And just one other thing on the demise of judicial independence and the West Bank. What Guy mentioned was the settler minister's interest in expanding settlements and annexation, which the court could have provided a possible block or two. There used to be something called illegal settlements on the West Bank, and there are many over 100 legal settlements. I forgot the exact number. They are now going to all be declared legal. And the Supreme Court will not be available to challenge that in the direction which this government is headed. Steve.
Is there any concern in Netanyahu of losing support of American Jews, many of whom are not even considered Jewish by the Zionist extremists?
Can people hear? Because I'll repeat it if you can't.
I would say that. Is there any concern when the Netanyahu losing support in the United States among the American Jews, many of whom are not even considered really Jews among the extreme Zionist parties? And then what happens to Israel?
Yeah, so the reason we're holding this event is because this is a moving event, right? Like the laws have been introduced into parliament, being debated, voted, most of them voted for and passed in a first vote, and in order to become the law of the land, they need to pass second and third vote. So there is a process that is happening as we speak, in which the government is ramping through these laws, but on the other hand, civil society in Israel is pushing back, both civil society in Israel, but also trying to mobilize support in the one place that Netanyahu might be listened to which is the United States. So Dan mentioned before that Poland and Hungary are embedded within the EU, and Israel is not embedded in any, but we are embedded within an alliance with the United States, and this is alliance that like prime ministers and governments in Israel traditionally view the alliance with the United States as absolutely vital for the security of the country, right? Part of the national security of Israel is the fact that we in this alliance with the United States that will come to defend the country, given the shared values that we have as like two democracies. Like Israel always likes to declare itself the only democracy in the Middle East. This kind of alliance is now questioned, right? And part of the mobilization of the forces in Israel is to try and also mobilize Democrats in the United States, Democrats not in the Democratic Party, Democrats as like people that care about democracy, in a way that will provide some leverage over stopping some of the some of them, more radical overhaul propositions. I think all levers, like, if we want to stop that, all levers are important. Like, and that's what we're seeing in Israel. There's like civil society mobilizing. There's like reserve officers that are mobilizing. There are economists that are mobilizing and talking about like the possible economic damage. And I think Americans, I don't think it's just Jewish people. I think just in general, I mean, I think America has like an important role in trying to signal to Israel that if Israel ceases to be a democracy and we don't share these values, there's going to be consequences. Right? I think that that's really important to raise the stakes of some of the actions that we see in play. Dan, you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I just want to add something on this. It's very encouraging from the perspective of defending rule of law in Israel and democracy to see the mass mobilization, society, many groups across society, really in hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets mobilizing on this. So that's encouraging. I wouldn't personally count, and encouraging that they're trying to get attention from democratic allies like the US, but I wouldn't count on the international pressure much. I mean, I'll just be pessimistic. I mean, my experience in watching this in other countries suggests to me that when it comes to things like attacks on the judiciary, they're just a little too abstract to really mobilize that international pressure and intervention. Like, let's say in Hungary and Poland, it's when they got to really substantive policies, let's say like the attacks on LGBTQ populations, that got more international pressure. That's like when the EU finally stepped in, right? And that was kind of the trigger in 21 and 2. Whereas, these attacks on how judges are appointed, they can always be disguised and sort of dressed up as, well, these are reforms and we are, trying to make the judiciary more responsive to our elected officials. I mean, it's all BS, but it's hard for international partners, I think, often to step in on those kind of abstract issues more than the problem is that the timing is they capture the judiciary, then the substantive attacks come later, but by then you've already got control. And then I guess the last thing I'd say there is something Guy was saying, really reminds me of this. Why this is such a critical moment, as you said at the beginning, is if these things go through, they're very hard to reverse, very hard, because how do you even reverse them in a kind of manner that's consistent with rule of law norms? So think like in Hungary, one of Orban's clever moves, which then they replicated in Poland, was he lowered the retirement age for judges, thereby basically decapitating the senior judiciary. He basically forced all the senior judges in the country into retirement. He's, by the way, doing the same thing with the army right now. And then later, this was declared to be illegal, but then they said, well, we've already appointed replacements. Getting rid of them would also violate their rights. So what are we supposed to do? So, basically these people never got their jobs back, right? And so I think if this stuff goes through, right, then Israel's in a real problem, because even a new government, if they could somehow get back in power, it'd be very hard to just quickly undo it.
Yeah, I think one thing that is unique in Israel that I think is different from Poland, from Hungary and Poland, is the role that the military plays in Israel in society, and the people that are now in the streets is really the backbone not only of the economy in terms of like the contribution to GDP and to tax money, but also in contribution to the military and the reserves, right? And the concern that is starting to filter into at least some members of the coalition that are ramping through these laws is that there is going to be some massive disobedience in the military if these laws are going to pass. We see it in all parts of the military, and the Israeli military is highly dependent on the reserves. There was a letter that came out of one that was made like a lot of headlines as pilots. There's a F-15 unit that if Israel is going to ever bomb the Iran nuclear capabilities, is this unit is part of what we know is going to be is the plan of the operation, and 37 out of 41 members of that unit signed saying that they are not going to show up to the next round of training. If 37 out of 41, right? If these laws are going to pass, right? And so that obviously resonates. That obviously, something that Netanyahu needs to address, and in fact he's addressed. A lot of members of this coalition have been attacking the pilots, attacking other parts of the reserve. It's not clear to me that this is it's a winning strategy, because you basically attack people that are considered the most revered part of society, right? And attacking them as kind of lefty, idealists, detached, paid by, the US, by source, right? It doesn't really resonate with anyone in the public. And I think part of my concern is not just the health of the democracy in the country, but also the long-term security of the country, because the military will be a different military if Israel ceases to be a democracy. I saw something.
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. Right now, you kind of discussed the problems and the dangers to Israeli democracy, but I think it's worthwhile to kind of try to think about the other side's perception of what is happening. And the perception is very difficult to deal with, I think, because the perception is that in 1995, as you mentioned, the Israeli Supreme Court, High Court, has asserted its power to annul law, even though Israel has no constitution. So the perception is, and there is legal truth to that, is that it was a power grab by the High Court. And as the years go by, most recently the court has declared that he also might have the power to annul basic laws, which were in fact the source of his kind of authority for constitutional review. So so the situation in Israel is closer to Poland, closer to Hungary than in Poland, in the sense that right now the government has the requisite majority to kind of declare the law. So if the perception is that what's happening until now is a power grab by the judiciary, and every objection to the reform is part of that power grab, how do you speak with the other side?
Can you hear the question in the back?
I can repeat it.
Okay.
So I think the question is trying to think about some of where the side that is pushing for the reform is coming from, and the fact that this is on the base of an assertion of the high courts in Israel in the mid-90s that it has judicial review, even though Israel doesn't have a formal constitution that enshrines that, and the fact that there's some parts of the population that might feel that they've been marginalized, or they can't really assert their right to govern because the Supreme Court has taken this. So a few responses to that. The first one is judicial review doesn't exist also in the US Constitution. Right? So let's start it is not uncommon in the history of countries that courts find ways of asserting some judicial review, even if it's not formally enshrined in the Constitution.
The U.S. has a constitution.
What's that?
So importantly, the U.S. does have a constitution.
No, but it doesn't have a right to judicial review.
Right, you're right.
So, which is more extreme, right? Because now, okay, I'll just say one. The second thing I will say that the use of judicial review in Israel has been by the courts has been done sparsely since 1990. It's a bit, I think, before 1995. I think the early. Well, in the last 30 years, it's been used 22 times to either annul a law or some parts of the law, and only when there's some sense that the law violates some of the basic laws, the Kvod Adam V'Chiruto, which is human
Dignity.
dignity, what will be the thing?
Human dignity and liberty.
Yeah, human dignity and liberty, and חופש העיסוק, which is the right to occupation. These two basic laws have clauses that can be read as granting the courts a right, because they say that no law should violate them, should be an opposition. Who interprets that, right? Like the court basically said, like, who has the responsibility to interpret? Well, obviously the legislator intended that to be us. So I would just say that, like, but I think it's really important to be clear that, like, it's used very, very conservatively, right? This way. But the last point is that I think you're right, that it's possible that Israel judicial system needs some reform. I just think that the way it's being done and the proposals that are on the table are beyond what a correction will entail, right? It's, if you are going to change the rules of the game, it's one thing to work within the rules of the game. If you change the rules of the game, I think it's important to change them in a deliberative process, in an inclusive process, in a process that is slow, where you think at each stage about what are the implications, what are the legal implications, what are the economic implications, what are the security implications. We are seeing none of this, right? And so I think it's not just what is proposed, but also how it is being run through, that doesn't show a lot of goodwill from the other side, just as like a corrective to some possible injustice. So I'm going to leave it here, but I would just say that, like, I think the opposition in Israel is willing to have a debate about, like, a compromise. I think they made it just only one. There was only one prerequisite, which is to halt the legislation, which is the government refused. So the opposition says we're not going to negotiate with a gun to our heads.
Right, we had a question back here, but hold that for a second. I will get to you, but we have a couple of questions from people who are watching online, and I would like to get to them. So I'm going to ask them together. Is opposition leader Lapid being unreasonable by insisting that the legislative process be frozen before engaging in negotiations towards consensus? And then secondly, and if you could answer them as quickly as you can, so this gentleman will get his question in. The second question is, with such massive protests, how can the government realistically be expected to maintain civil order in the months to come? And what happens if the Supreme Court annuls the government's legal overhaul? So that's three questions. If you could just answer
Really
1, 2, 3.
Really briefly. The third one is there's going to be, it's possible we're heading to some constitutional crisis where, where they're going to pass this, the Supreme Court will say this is unconstitutional. And then the question is, like, who
Maybe they won't publish it.
Maybe they won't publish it. But I won't be surprised if we're heading to some constitutional crisis where the police or the military will have to decide who do they answer to. This is an uncharted territory in Israel, so your guess is as good as mine, because I don't know what will be the. How does the government expect to maintain order? I mean, I actually don't think that order is like the only, like, I mean, people are in the streets, trying to assert what they believe is their right to protest. So far, it's been largely non-violent protest. So I don't think that this is going to change, but like the people are saying, well, you are going to take my rights, I'm going to fight for them, right? And so I don't know. I mean, it could be bloody, but I don't think that that's necessarily the protesters' fault, but rather responding to a process that they believe is being ramped way too fast in order to take into consideration all the implications to the order.
And is Lapid being reasonable or
I don't know, we seem to disagree. I mean, I think that, like, the opposition has made only one request or one demand, which is basically stopping the legislation, because negotiating when the process is still going through is basically negotiating with a gun to your head. And I think that they are also right to say, and that's a justification of Lapid, it basically says, if you're really serious in negotiating and not just pretending to negotiate in order to kind of like derail the protest movement, but you're actually sincere in trying to find a common ground, then why continue with the legislative process, right? If you're actually sincere, right? And the opposition is worried that if they will negotiate while the legislative process, they're just playing to the hands of the government to say, so like there was a negotiation, that's the product of negotiation, or the negotiation failed, we came with goodwill. So they don't want to give the government the pretense of a process that is deliberative when there's no goodwill. And I think that the bid is not unreasonable. I think it's basically saying, if you are genuinely open to a negotiation, to find a common ground, you need to first halt this legislation. And if you don't do that, you're just basically showing that you don't have a goodwill, and I won't participate in a sham negotiation that will just legitimate a process that we all know the result at the end. I don't think it's unreasonable.
No, with all of the differences, so excuse the comparison, but it's like negotiating with Putin while he's bombing your cities into rubble.
I also think Lapid is not the issue here. I think that this protest is way outside. I mean, I think the reason this is a successful protest is because it's actually non-partisan. Because like Lapid, the first time that he even came to any of the demonstration was like in week 4, something like that. And also after he got like a lot of heat that he hasn't participated. We are now in week 10 of the protest. The reason that this is so powerful, I think, is because it comes across as a genuine concern of people from across the aisle, from across the spectrum. There are also religious people in the crowd. There are also Arabs in the crowd. There are also Mizrahi. It's not just an Ashkenazi educated middle class that is in this crowd. And I think that the fact that politicians are not the main speakers, that this is not driven by political parties, is the strength of the protest movement, and what gives me, 5% kind of likelihood that this might not pass. If this was about like political parties that are running through, organizing the opposition, I think this would be already, this would be gone. So I don't think Lapid is even the story.
Yeah, that makes sense. This gentleman who's been waiting.
I think you mentioned that there were 2 or 3 readings left in the bills, and you sort of answered the question. But let's just assume that demonstrations go on and you have all these letters. Is the process going to change, or are they going to ram through the bills? What is your?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I think we know. I think we know what the Orthodox wants. I think we know what the religious Zionists want. I think I know what most Likud members want. The only person that I really don't fully know how he's thinking about this is Netanyahu. Netanyahu is on record for many years talking about the importance of an independent judiciary in Israel. He said, under my watch, we will never. He's on record saying that multiple times. He stopped radical legislation in the past as a prime minister. He, is on record saying that. I think that Netanyahu genuinely cares about the long-term security of the country, and I think that Netanyahu genuinely cares about the stability of the economy. I think he's presented by a lot of evidence that passing this will jeopardize the long-term security of Israel and Israel's economic stability. And what he thinks at night is as anyone's guess. He can stop the madness tomorrow if that's what he wants. He can. He's the prime minister, and he's a very shrewd politician. He's a very powerful prime minister. But we don't know whether that's what he wants. I think there's a lot of second guessing about like his legal exposure and how that's playing out, and whether he's really in control of the process or he's like led by Ben Gvir. And I really think that that's like the thing that we don't know. I think that like when people pretend that they know what's going on, I think that's a little bit of hubris. And I would not pretend to know what's going on between the power of, but I think Netanyahu I think he's the key person. If he thinks that the price that Israel is going to pay in security and economy is too high to pay, there's a world in which he stops that. Even with his kind of like exposure of his legal exposure. I don't think the legal exposure is like the only driving force.
I'm afraid that we're going to have to wrap it up. I'm sorry I didn't
Yeah.
get back to
No,
you
it's all right.
again, but thank you both very much.
Before I get up, I wanted to thank you on behalf of Perry Wolfhouse for what is no doubt, as we promised, an extremely thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion. You can always find those here. And again, I'm hoping once again that you are leaving knowing more than when you entered this building. And I wanted to just, again, thank Dan, thank Cindy, and thank Guy. And to let you know, there are a couple other things coming up. Just bear with me for 1 second. So one is that tomorrow we'll be celebrating a belated International Women's Day, which I know all of you know was March 8th, but it was during spring break. So we'll be having a program, the regularly scheduled World Day at 4 o'clock in the World Forum. It looks at how women's rights and protests are transforming societies. The Center for Africana Studies, our dear colleagues at the Center for Africana Studies are going to be hosting the president of Botswana on the 20th of March at 5:30, also in the World Forum, but you can register for that at the Center for Africana Studies website. And that link, for those of you who are online, will be in the chat function. And last but not least, on the 22nd, we're going to have 2 public programs related to our annual colloquium. And this year it focuses on extreme heat. In the morning, we'll be hearing from, I believe it's 5, it may be 7, I can't never remember the number, but 5 chief heat officers from around the world, including Chile, Athens, Greece, the US, Sierra Leone, and Mexico. Later in the afternoon, we'll be meeting with the author, Jeff Goodall, who's written a book, as you know, on extreme heat that's forthcoming. Trying to figure out how we're all going to survive in this kind of incredible climate emergency. So I hope that you'll go online and sign up. And we hope that you will share these possibilities with people in your network. As usual, there's a grab and go snack in the student lounge. And as usual, you can find this presentation on YouTube in a couple of days. You can follow all of our programs on social media. So thanks again.
Thank you.